Praise God. If we may, be seated, please. Our Lord is great and His goodness is infinite toward us. If we may tonight, I would like to get into immediately our study in systematic theology, and it may prove to be the last of those dealing in this subsection of epistemology and the subsection underneath that, which is formal logic. We have been looking at various forms of theological argument. We've seen that they all can sometimes be used properly and sometimes be used improperly. It depends on whether or not you have the truth on your side. So we've looked at everything from the irrelevant conclusion down through various other things, and I think we ended up looking at appeals to pity and to emotion. And so tonight we're going to be on number 6, and I only have a few more. These are, however, just as interesting, I think. I think it's all been very interesting, worthwhile study to look at these matters. These are just as interesting as well as just as important as the earlier types of formal arguments that we have looked at. And again, I can remind you that these are things that pop up not only in the readings, sometimes that you do, but they will pop up in the conversations that you have with other people. And when we call these various forms of theological argument, we don't mean to imply by that, and I think I've been rather clear on this matter, that they are always necessarily false or erroneous or wrong. And they're certainly not always something that we see in other people, because then it would be something like a negative circumstantial ad hominem, and we would reject it because we know that's what the opponents do. We found examples of these arguments right from Jesus' lips and right from the pen of the Apostle Paul himself. It's just that so often, and here's what I've been trying to emphasize, so often you find these various forms of theological argument used by the opponents of truth to try to undermine the truth. And you just have to recognize it and say, listen, Joe or Mary, here's what you're doing. Aristotle taught me this, and how could you know anything about the Bible when you don't even know anything about Aristotle? Because generally they're claiming that they've got such a superior education to what you have. You're just a fundamentalist hillbilly, you know, that they're going to undermine your faith in the Bible. And they don't even understand, which they couldn't do anyway. You wouldn't allow them to, would you? Which they don't understand. They don't understand the fact that they need to go back and maybe touch up on the logic class that they slept most of the way through. Number 6, we're going to call it false calls. False, you know what that word is, like false prophets. Calls, C-A-U-S-E. Sometimes it's called non-causa pro causa in Latin. Now there are many, many different errors regarding causality. So I'll just write that word up here. We're only going to look at one. I don't know if I'm writing large enough for everyone, but I have more to write up here and tack on later. I only want to deal with one of these, although there are many, many different errors regarding causality. Now, you know that every effect has a cause, right? And every cause produces an effect. So, anytime you get into matters and you get anywhere near history or the history of beliefs or the history of theology, then we're dealing with cause and effect. Or we're dealing with something, A, that came first and something else, B, that came later. Are they related? Is one the effect of an earlier cause, or is it not? Many, many times, people will try to make a certain doctrine or belief the effect of an earlier cause, and they misidentify the cause. So that's what we mean by false cause. It mistakenly identifies the cause of an effect. We're not denying, because we know about the way the world turns and as life is, we're not denying that effects have causes. All effects have causes. All effects have a cause. But when a person mistakenly identifies the cause of the effect, then this is non-causa pro causa. It's a false cause as far as theology is concerned. Now, if we may start on a lighter note tonight, and perhaps even your children will appreciate this example. Children, you might want to listen up. There is a classic example here And it concerns a farmer and his barnyard and certain animals that were there. Now, if you've heard the story before, just bear with the rest of us who like to be like little children, enjoy hearing stories like this that are sometimes so incredibly profound. It's a classic example that you'll probably even find in a textbook on logic concerning non-causa pro causa or post hoc ergo propter hoc. We'll give its later name later, and you'll see why I'm reserving that revelation for the end. Well, once upon a time in Farmer Jones' property, he had a barn with a barnyard, and he had many animals there, and the horse one day went over to the pig and said, "Mr. Pig, let me speak with you for a moment." "Yes, I'm busy, but how may I help you today, horse?" Well, the horse said, "Mr. Pig, do you see that creature over there?" What creature?" "The one sitting on the fence post there." Oh, yes, Rooster. You mean Mr. Rooster?" "Yes, Mr. Rooster." "Yes, what about him?" "I don't like him," said the horse. Well, the pig responded, "Why not? Why don't you? Look at his chest. He's filled with pride. The thing is pumped out so far. I just can't stand that bird." Well, the pig got the message, and he began to grumble a little bit himself, and so pretty soon the barnyard cat came into view, and the pig sidled up to the cat and said, "Mr. Cat, do you see that creature sitting over there?" Let me relieve your attention in the midst of this story, by the way. You're not supposed to laugh. It's going to be nothing funny at all. It's just a revelation, okay? You know, if you think the speaker's telling a joke, you got to go, all right, now, I haven't heard anything funny yet, and I don't know if I'll miss the punchline or not. So you haven't missed it. You're not supposed to laugh anyway. Yes, I see that creature. What about him? He's filled with pride. How do you know? I saw him yesterday, and you should have seen the way he would strut. He would just strut across the barnyard, and he's filled with pride. And I don't like him. The cat said, "Well, I don't like him either then." So one day all the animals got together, and they decided, we're going to do something about Mr. Proud over there, the one with the chest out and who struts through the barnyard all the time. So they cornered him one time, and it was probably about 8:30 or so in the morning, and they said, "Mr. Rooster, you have a majority against you. We all are opposed to you. You're filled with pride." "Pride? In my heart? I don't think so. How horrible to say of a creature like me. What makes you think that?" "Well, we see your chest pumped out all the time, and we see you strutting through the barnyard all the time, filled with pride." He said, "Yeah, I do have a lot of pride, but it doesn't relate to my chest or to my legs at all." He said, "Haven't you realized that after I crow each morning, the sun rises? All you can do is produce milk and, clean the barn out of the mice in it. But after I crow each morning, the sun rises. Wouldn't you be a significant person and feel well about yourself if you had that type of role in life?" Well, it's a classic example of false cause. He associates the sun rising with him crowing by virtue of the fact that his crowing is the cause of the sun rising, which is the effect. All right? That's non-causa pro causa. That's false cause. It seems as though the two are somehow related, because the rooster crows when it's still dark, right? The rooster crows and the sun rises. And so if you're really intelligent, you put the two together, right? You say, well, I assume that the sun heard and therefore responded to the crowing of the rooster. The rooster crowed and the sun rose. Well, many examples of this pop up in theology. Let me give you one. Let's take the anti-divine healers. Now, if you haven't run into this, well, I don't even need to say that because we all have run into this. Now, they'll say something like this. You're teaching them the biblical view of healing, that God doesn't need anything but your faith in His promises, and they will tell you God's not opposed to medicine, because listen to this story. They'll tell one about themselves or about someone they knew, and it's probably happened to everybody, so it wouldn't matter who the specimen was. But they'll say, John Smith took his medicine, and then, or went for the examination and the surgery, whatever, took his medicine, and then prayed to God for his healing, and the Lord healed him. How do we know? Because the next day he got feeling better. Now, how do you refute an argument like that, you see? They say that he took his medicine and prayed to God, and he got feeling better. The disease, the symptoms all left. The Lord healed him. See, it's false cause. He's saying there that the medicine and the prayer combined is the will of God, and the result of that is that the Lord has healed him. And what we would say, you're mistakenly identifying the cause of the effect. They think, really, that it's the Lord and their prayer in the Lord that has done that. It's the medicine. It's the medicine. And if they don't believe it's that, if they don't really believe it's that, then why are they still taking it? Just say, it's not the medicine, right? It was the prayer. You're trying to glorify God, right? That's right. It wasn't the medication. I pray to the Lord. All right. Then you won't need medication the next go around, will you? Amen. You'll just rely on prayer this time. Well, no, I didn't mean that. All right. Somebody's not thinking very well here. False calls. False calls. They are mistakenly identifying the cause of an effect. The effect is healing. The cause of that, they say, is their faith in God. We would say if you took medicine and then prayed, your prayer was not heard by God because you weren't in the will of God. And so you mistakenly identified the cause. The effect we'll all agree on, you got healed. But what's the cause of that? We would say medicine and not prayer. And you can prove that they really believe the same thing with the example or with the scenario I just gave. Take their medicine away next time and they won't be willing to trust God. They really believe at the end of the day that it's their medicine that brought the cure. And what they would like to do is to sanctify their medicine by, in Jesus' name, afterwards. Have you ever heard such a contradiction? Taking medicine, saying, Lord, bless it now to my body in Jesus' name. Well, we know that God doesn't respond to or listen to, doesn't even hear the prayer of a sinner, John 9:31, and he certainly doesn't listen to such a heathen, abominable prayer. God could not possibly answer a person's prayer like that. Now, I know some people maybe on the other side of the fence who, because of whatever their beliefs are, they would say, well, I don't care whether medicine was involved or not. And they're on the pro-healing side, the pro-biblical view. All healing is from God. And so healing, even that healing, came from God, and God just overlooked the medicine. I don't know why people are afraid just to say that medicine does, on occasion anyway, and maybe times more than occasionally, have curative effects to it. There's no question about that. Or I don't have any question about that. So to me, the matter is not whether medicine will cure a person, it's whether or not it's scriptural to use it. It's not whether medicine has any curative powers to it. It probably does. I believe that it does. But the question is something much more basic here. We have to stay within the will of God. Or, let me give you an example, same person that I've given you earlier. That must have been back under number 4, which would have been negative circumstantial ad hominem. And you could use it there because, remember, an ad hominem argument is an argument to or against the man. And here a negative circumstantial one is you relate negative circumstances in your mind to a particular person, and therefore to anything that person believes, or to what that person believes that you don't want to have to believe. You'd rather reject it rather than on a scriptural basis, on the basis of a negative circumstantial ad hominem argument. And that example is divorce and remarriage, and the early 16th century figure Erasmus. And I told you we would use this again. We would use the case of Erasmus again. Now, I think I'll give you its other name here. I'll spell it all out. I assume you could put this together in English anyway. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's the same thing as false calls, by the way. Same thing as non-calls or pro-calls. It happens to have a little different name, and this name will be very important now. I've just said it before, and it's just a fancy technical term as far as you're concerned, but now it'll become very important. Do we all understand from the previous teaching of a week or so ago what this example is all about with Erasmus and divorce and remarriage? Now, there are some people who are, well, if you got your Bible, let's go over there real quickly in case you're not familiar with some of the details behind this. Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife. Now we know here in Matthew 5 that Jesus is coming against certain perversions of things found even in the Old Testament. At least some of these things found in the Old Testament. I don't know that you could find verse 43 there. that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, because the Bible really didn't teach that in the Old Testament, but I guess there are some passages. Take the annihilation of the Canaanites by the invading Israelites as a case in point, that could be so construed or misconstrued as to provide evidence for such a point. So we know Deuteronomy 24, if you divorce your wife, you find some uncleanness in her, which is a whole matter in itself, and in order to divorce her, it has to be something formal. It has to be a writing of divorcement, a bill of writing of divorcement before you can divorce. All right, so anyway, verse 32, but I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, in other words, whosoever shall go through this business of writing a bill of divorcement, saving for the cause of fornication, he does reserve that as an exception, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. Now, just what is the force of these two verses here? Well, it's kind of been a standard view of the Christian church for quite some time. Let's just say this. It's been a Protestant view for 100 years in this country, that what we have here is very strong teaching, no question about that, on divorce and remarriage, that has these particular parts to it, that all cases of divorce and remarriage where fornication is not the cause, we're talking about causes, right? Where fornication is not the cause for the divorce, where fornication is not the cause, would be illegal there, therefore an immoral. Now, I have to also add in that most Christian groups and churches will also take what they call the Pauline privilege. It comes from a passage in 1 Corinthians 7. It deals with so-called desertion of a Christian by an unbelieving spouse, and they sometimes will slip that in as two legitimate grounds for scriptural divorce. Let's just deal with that for a moment. Scriptural divorce. Well, that's another matter over there, and I don't agree with that view on 1 Corinthians 7. But here in Matthew 5:32, it should be very clear to anyone that there is a scriptural grounds for divorce, saving for the cause of fornication. If you put your wife away for any other reason than this, then we know what the end of the verse has to say. So let's come back. Well, what if it's for this reason? Then if he said if you put your wife away for any other reason than this, it's adultery, then if you put your wife away for this reason, it couldn't be adultery then. Or you've got nonsense, you've got double talk on your hands. All right, most people are fairly comfortable with that and satisfied with that. Not everyone's totally comfortable, but most people are. Well, then, of course, the big question, though, is remarriage. Now, you're divorced. It's been a scriptural divorce. But what about the question of remarriage? Well, it's the belief of some that also contained right here in this verse, Matthew 5:32, and its fellow passage, which would be Matthew 19, as I have shown you with another form of reasoning, that in this verse you actually find grounds for remarriage as well. All right, now, some people don't like that, and they are to be commended for their desire to maintain sexual purity and faith purity and all of this in a Christian's life, but they don't agree with this, and so one of their methods of attack, and I hope that it doesn't really amount to anything major, because it would be non causa pro causa. It'd be post hoc ergo propter hoc is what it would be. But I hear it too often, and it troubles me, it bothers me. And that is to say that this view, which has become the current evangelical view, the standard Christian, let's say, the standard Christian view really in the world today, that this view was not seen anywhere in church history until around 1516 and the days of Desiderius Erasmus. Now, we know Erasmus from several things, Dutch humanist and Roman Catholic scholar. Now, that's the negative circumstantial ad hominem thing that we got in before. Dutch humanist, Roman Catholic scholar who never left the moorings of his mother church, as did his fellow Martin Luther. All right, those would be the things you'd use for negative circumstantial ad hominem. They're not terribly important right here, for we're talking about post hoc ergo propter hoc. But what we are talking about is this, that nowhere in church history can you find this view of Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. Divorce allowed for one scriptural grounds and one alone, and that's fornication, and remarriage afterwards. A subsequent remarriage after a scriptural divorce would be the way to present the case. It's not found in church history until the time of Desiderius Erasmus. Now, What is the point of all of that then? Post hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates from Latin into English as this: after this, therefore, because of this. Now the light should be dawning on you right about now. Nothing makes any sense till I give you the English translation of this Latin phrase. After this, therefore, because of this. Because we couldn't find it earlier in church history than Erasmus. Erasmus taught it. It has become accepted among, well, Protestants, and he was a Roman Catholic. So that really says how, they would say, how leavening and pervasive his view has been. But now that we see it after this, it's like the crowing of the rooster in the sun. The sun rose after, so therefore it must be because, not necessarily so. That's a false form of argumentation, just as false as the summer day is long. And you have to be able to spot those things. I gave you a real easy example here with divine healing. Someone took their medicine, prayed, God healed them, and said, see, Lord answers prayer. We would say, no, see, the devil works through medicine. We all agree on the effect. The person got healed. We differ dramatically and drastically on the cause. They say God did it. We say your medicine did it. That should be something easy for all of us to understand. But you notice how crucial it is to understand. If you don't worry about the phrase. You probably won't remember this long phrase up here. Just understand you've got to identify the right cause for the right effect. You've got to attach. If you've got a list of causes and effects up here, you've got to be able to draw your lines and your X's together and match them up properly. Otherwise, you end up with non-cause, a pro-cause, a false cause, post hoc, ergo propter hoc. And this is exactly what we have in this case with Erasmus here. Exactly. They say you don't find it earlier in church history, which is exactly right. See now, if somebody 14 years before him taught it and it became a major theory, then of course you would never use this. But because that much of your story is true, it was not found in church history prior to this. Let's say from 100 A.D. up until the time of Erasmus, it was not found. So what do we have? After this, therefore, because of this, then you build on a post hoc ergo propter hoc, you build on that negative circumstantial ad hominem argument because we don't like Erasmus because of two things about him, Dutch humanist, Roman Catholic, lifelong, who never left the church. Therefore, this argument or this view of scriptural divorce and subsequent remarriage could not possibly be right. Well, of course, the big problem with that is it doesn't matter what you find in church history. It only matters what you find in the Word of God. And to be sure, our opponents on this particular issue would agree with us there. So we agree on that in principle. Someone is not working their principle out consistently, though. They really don't care, and we really don't care what you do find or don't find in church history because that's not our sounding board. That's not our standard. Our standard is the inerrant Word of God. It's not what Erasmus taught or didn't teach. Because, let me just give you a little ammunition. Now, here's what, well, you don't pull this on someone, but you keep it in your own mind. Here's what you do to those people who use Erasmus in the divorce and remarriage thing. Here's what you do with them. You say, all right, now, you're using a post hoc ergo propter hoc argument. After this, therefore, because of this. Now, I'm going to use that on you, and watch how you're not going to like this at all. I'm going to use this on you concerning pre-tribulationism, premillennialism. I'm going to use this on you. A so-called secret rapture of the church, that is prior to the tribulation, was not found anywhere in church history up into the times of John Nelson Darby. And there's no scholar who is reputable who can gainsay that or deny that. Now, there's no question about the fact that the early church was premillennial. I trust you understand there's a difference, or there can be, there shouldn't be, because premillennialism is the biblical view. Premillennialism is like a big catchphrase that can describe more or less in scriptural terms one's eschatology. But there is a big difference between premillennialism and pre-tribulationism. One is a comment as to when Christ returns with the millennium in view. Christ returns prior. That doesn't tell us a thing about the date or the chronology of the rapture of the church, right? Those are two different phrases. They're aimed at two different doctrines. Pre-tribulationism is a rapture doctrine. Premillennialism is a second advent millennial doctrine. and they're not necessarily related. So I got off on that in case anybody knows enough in our body, and I don't know, or who would hear this tape, to say, well, wait a minute, you can't say that was never taught in church history until John Nelson Darby in the 1820s or 30s, because I thought that the early church, 2nd, 3rd century, was chiliastic. They were millennial. They were premillennial. They were not post or amillennial. That's right, they were. But that might better be called classical or classic premillennialism, which includes with it as a little subcategory post-tribulationism. Now, am I giving you too much information? You need to be thinking or writing a lot of this down, thinking of it or writing it down, or just if it's like the back of your hand to you, then you can stare at me like some of you are doing. So it must be like the back of your hand. That's true. 2nd, 3rd century churches, from the writings of apostolic or post-apostolic fathers, sub-apostolic fathers that we have, does reveal the fact that they were premillennial. They were premillennial. They were chiliast or chiliastic. But a part of their premillennialism was post-tribulationism. And we'll say more about that in our studies of that, when and where it comes up in Revelation, because, you got easy, clear support for the fact that Jesus is coming back for an elect people who will be gathered by the angels at the tribulation's conclusion. When you get over into a passage like 1 Thessalonians 4, it doesn't say a word about the tribulation. How do you know when that applies? You're just assuming that it applies. Well, you say, I'm not assuming, you're building it on a complex series of arguments. You couldn't get that from 1 Thessalonians 4. You're going to have to say, well, it's because of this, and then this, and then this. So I'm saying to you this, if you just read the Bible kind of plain and didn't think a whole lot, I think you'd probably end up with premillennialism in the post-tribulational form. Just because you've got clear passages that say when Jesus returns, Matthew 24, he'll send his angels and they'll gather the elect from the four corners of the earth. You've got clear passages. What about somebody going somewhere, escaping the tribulation, going up before the tribulation? Well, you say, well, I've got a clear verse for that. What is it? Name it for me. Say Revelation 3:10. Well, now, that verse was spoken to the Philadelphian church there. Now, how could it have been spoken to them, but it didn't really apply to them? It only applies to the last generation of faithful Christians just before the tribulation begins. See, then now you're on another goose chase, not a goose one, it's a valid one, of saying, well, the reason I believe I can apply this, and you're going to start into this complex series of arguments. You just understand what I'm saying now? And these people in our circles, we are all what? Premillennial, pre-tribulational. Wasn't taught in church history until the 1800s. At least with our view on divorce and remarriage, we go back to the 1500s for our founding father. You only go back to the 1800s for yours. John Nelson Darby, or if we could make it worse, we could say a Scottish deranged girl by the name of MacDonald. Margaret MacDonald is the one who got some ecstatic visions about this, shared them with Darby or with Irvingite, the other Irvingites, and Darby got them, and Darby began to popularize them. And then one day, Mr. Schofield was born, and Schofield and Dallas Seminary has really popularized them. You know what? That is a serious stumbling block. I'm not making light of the whole matter. It's a serious stumbling block for a lot of Christians out there as far as pre-tribulationism is concerned. They'll tell you right away, if they know anything, that was not heard of in the church until John Nelson Darby. And by the way, I think we have, back in our series in biblical literature, John Nelson Darby did a Bible translation in 1871, and we have a tape or two dealing with that and some of his pre-tribulational views then. So then what are these people going to say? See, all we've done is we've turned the same type of argument, this post hoc ergo propter hoc, this same type of argument, we've turned it around on you with another example. And you cannot get away from that fact that in church history you cannot find pre-tribulationism taught until John Nelson Darby. And yet you believe it, don't you? Would ask them. And say, well, of course I do. But you know what they'd tell us? Well, I don't care, who first taught it in its revised form. I believe that it has biblical support. You know what? That's all we're doing with regard to Matthew 5:32, divorce and remarriage. It doesn't really matter, did the church fall away from the right view? And it was a Dutch Roman Catholic humanist scholar who was the first one to see some light on this matter, and maybe he saw the light for wrong, selfish motives or whatever. That's really kind of a moot point as far as I'm concerned. What's significant is what does Jesus say in Matthew 5 and in Matthew chapter 19. So these would be some of the things that I would present in this regard. And so these are some matters that we need to be aware of when it comes to various forms of theological argumentation. We don't want to be caught in a false form of arguing. Because then a person you say, well, I still might have the truth. You might, but they can pull your form of arguing out from under you, and then you have already lost credibility in their eyes. Because you might say, well, I still have a true point I'm trying to get across here. And they'll say, yeah, but you did it in a devious, deceptive manner. This business of saying, after Erasmus, therefore because of him, we'll grant it's after. That you don't find it in church history as it is after. But you will also grant that the sun rises after the rooster crows, right? And you'll also agree with the fact that pre-tribulationism was taught after, not before, after John Nelson Darby taught it. So we'll agree with after this, therefore because of this? No, we won't agree with that. We won't agree with it in any of those cases, not with John Nelson Darby, not with Erasmus, and not with the rooster. It's after this, it's not necessarily therefore because of this. All right, you'll find these little things pop up in your own life, little examples in your own life, and you got to watch challenging someone after this, therefore because of this. You know, you'll see a person go through some episode in their life, and then you'll see them acting a certain way later on. And so you'll try to trace it back to, well, just because it's after doesn't mean it's because of. It's causality type thinking that you've got to get involved in here. We've got to make sure that we have a true cause and not a false cause. So I'm not impressed. You can tell that you're already kind of losing your credibility in my eyes when you try to tell me that Erasmus taught this, because I know what you mean by that. First of all, you mean negative circumstantial ad hominem, then you mean post hoc ergo propter hoc. And none of that, that's just chaff. And whether John Nelson Darby taught it or not is just chaff. What's important is, do we have biblical support for it all? Now, after we agree on that, then we can go back, and then our study of the fact that the church didn't teach something until Erasmus' day, or it didn't teach another matter until John Nelson Darby's day, is going to have a profound impact on our whole view of church history then. How is it that the church could have been in unbelief and darkness for so many centuries about certain matters? You know, if you believe they were, then you just believe that they were. That influences and affects your whole view of church history. You don't put a whole lot of confidence in a whole lot of anything then. If it took them almost... Can't you see where post-tribulational people are coming from? They're saying, you guys haven't... Our views are supported all the way back from the beginning of church history. If you've got so much light and this truth, quote-unquote, you have on your side, why did it take the church 2,000 years to discover it? They've got a pretty big point on their side. What we're going to have to do is give them a little lesson in church history, that church history is not all it was cut out to be, and maybe we can go back in the end of the New Testament and find something about what would happen shortly after the New Testament's closed. Well, I think we've done that somewhere before. If you're with me tonight, may we proceed? Number 7. You have any questions, by the way, on that one? You understand how that works. Don't let people manipulate you with that type of argument again. After this, therefore, because of this. Just make sure, is it because of it? If it's after, that's obvious. Just make sure whether or not it's because of this. Number 7 is called the complex question. The complex question. Now this means that because a question is asked with multiple parts, it's simply impossible to give a simple answer. By simple, we mean yes or no. This means that because a question is asked with multiple parts, it's impossible to give a simple answer. Now, I need a couple of men who will volunteer, and you have to be married. Can I have 2 volunteers of married men? We'll find out, won't we? All right, you volunteered by asking, is it embarrassing? And you volunteered by raising your hand. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and you don't know anything about complex questions, right? So you know that the only two answers that someone can be looking for from a question is a yes or a no. Now, you have to play the game so that everyone else will see the seriousness of dealing with complex questions. All right, brother, you volunteered first. Do you want the yes or the no as your answer? You want the yes. You'll take the no then. All right. Just like under false calls, there was a classic example, the crowing of the rooster. So also there is a classic example here. And the question, it's a question, complex question. The question is this, addressed to you, brother, first. Have you stopped beating your wife? That's good news that you finally have stopped that. That's good. Have you stopped beating your wife? No, we'll take the first word. No. Well, that's terrible. You see, we got him either way, didn't we? It's a complex, it's a big whopper of a question. Political candidates use it all the time. That's the way you get in the house, is you ask your opponent, have you stopped beating your wife? It's a whopper of you get the person either way they go. He says, yes, that's good. We're relieved that he finally stopped beating her. But we don't know how long it's been going on. He's been beating her, though. And he said no, so he's still a reprobate. He's still beating his wife. Well, I want to show you how serious dealing with complex questions, they are of such a nature that they refuse simple answers. You can't give yes or no's to them. And people try to get you in a corner, tell me, do you believe this or not? And it's a complex question here. It refuses an answer. It resists that, or if you'll be smart enough, you'll resist giving a yes or no answer because the question is complex. You see, you incriminate yourself either way you go. The only way for you to give a yes or no answer is if you've been beating your wife at some time, either previously or previously as well as currently. So really a complex question is a compound question. I don't mean by complex that it's difficult. I don't mean that by complex. I mean complex in the sense that it is compound. It is made up of two or more parts. And what are two parts here? This question, if you've got it down on your paper, have you stopped beating your wife? The classic political whopper. It's really two questions expressed as one. Can you dissect it? Break it up. It's got two questions in it. Not just one, it's got two. The first question is, have you beaten your wife before? The second question is, if you have, are you still doing it now? And what this classic whopper presupposes is an affirmative answer to the first question. It just presupposes that once they've got you there, they've got you on the whole question then. I'm going to give you some examples here in a moment. This happens all the time. By the way, well, let me give you that again, then I'll tell you my by the way. The first question is, have you been beating your wife? And secondly, if you have been, have you stopped by now? How would you like to be asked that question, you see? Have you stopped beating your wife? And you know, it's of such a nature. It's not only a complex question, it's an emotionally charged complex question that even if you don't give yes or no, regardless of what you say, as soon as the question is asked, guess what happens? You're already guilty. You are already guilty. If a newspaper writer starts saying, we wonder whether or not political candidate such and such smoked marijuana or was a homosexual earlier, whether or not they can bring out all the facts and refute that I've never had it and drug tests will prove it or eyewitnesses will prove it, just by bringing it up, we're kind of thinking, wow, well, what made the newspaper reporter even think of questioning that person in that area in the first place? What made me ever think of questioning you in the first place? Have you been beating your wife? So a person's already guilty, you see, with that type of complex question. But it's really made up of two parts. Have you been beating your wife? And if so, have you stopped? So what you have to do with questions like this is to say, friend, you are assuming something that isn't even true. And so your question, as stated, is completely inappropriate. You have to tell the person, friend, you're assuming something. Your question has two parts to it. You're assuming a certain answer to the first part. And because you're already assuming that. You're not even giving me a chance to answer it. Have you stopped beating your wife? I'm already assuming that you've been beating her earlier, right? I'm already assuming that. I haven't even asked you that question, have you ever beaten her before? Then, if you say yes, then I can ask, are you still doing it now? You don't even give them a chance to answer the first question. You already assume that you have been beating it now. I'm only asking, have you stopped doing that yet? You got to say, friend, you're assuming something that is not true. Therefore, your question is just inappropriate. It's just an inappropriate question. Can't even be answered. Because you've already done the answering of the first part. My by the way, I think, was going to be this. By the way, have you noticed that whenever we open up sometimes for questions around here, I rarely answer the question that you ask because often it's a complex question. It's got several parts to it. And I've got to say now this or then this or ask you, well, are you meaning this or are you meaning that? And it's rare when someone can just give such a crystal clear, simple question that therefore deserves a simple response, yes or no. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? That'd be a simple question that deserves a yes or no. But when you start adding in too many other things to it, it becomes a compound question that I can't answer. And you see, you might already be assuming something in the question, and therefore to answer it, and you're assuming that, and maybe I'm not, but maybe others are, then they get your impression from the question and not my impression from the answer. They get their impression from the answer, which is yours, and that's not the impression that I would desire to leave. So here are some examples. They're always cast in the form of questions. Remember, this is a complex question we're talking about. But someone might ask you, are you one of those unthinking fundamentalists? Well, what can you say? You are a fundamentalist in certain regards, right? But you're not unthinking. See, they just assume that if you're a fundamentalist, you don't think about things. You're born in Eastern Tennessee or Kentucky, and you just don't think about things. Or have you ever been asked, are you one of those crazy charismatics? Well, no, I'm not crazy. Yes, I am. See, I need a yes and a no. I need you to say, are you crazy? Then I'll say no. And then you can ask, are you a charismatic? And I'll say yes. And they'll say, you're crazy also. Well, that'll be all right. At least I got to state the fact that I'm not crazy, but I am charismatic. Are you one of those unthinking fundamentalists? No, yes. No to the first question, yes to the second one. Sometimes you have to answer that way. Are you a crazy charismatic? No, yes. No, I'm not crazy. Yes, I am. Or have you ever asked your children, will you be good and go to bed? Now, that's a complex question that you ought to avoid. Will you be good and go to bed? If they're smart, they'll say yes and no. Yes, I will be good, because going to bed isn't necessarily equated with being good, is it? There are many other ways of expressing one's goodness. Yes and no. Yes, I will be good. No, I will not go to bed. That's a complex question. We ask it of one another probably too many times. And if you're an unthinking fundamentalist and you'll just say yes or no, you just won't think about it. You're supposed to say, well, now wait just a minute. That question has 2, 3, 4, got to use them up. 7 parts to it there. It's got 7 parts. Yes, yes, no, yes, no. You got to break it all down before you can truly give answers to it so that no one is misled by what you say. There might be a joking way in which if someone asks us, are you an unthinking fundamentalist, we would just say yes. We don't think about anything, we just believe the Bible. That's what we would mean by it. But you see, you've got to interpret our answer the right way. Are you a crazy charismatic? Yeah, we're one of those fools for the Holy Spirit's sake. We're not really crazy, though. That's a complex question. And notice they're generally asked in a negative way, trying to indict a person. And while they try to indict you and you give your little simplistic answer, then you implicate yourself. So you have to be careful and try to separate the various parts, the various compounds of the question and give each one of them their proper answer. All right, let's come to number 8. Okay.